Representative Peter Welch, to rededicate the Danville Post Office in honor of Danville native Thaddeus Stevens. We'll begin hearing the national anthem sung by Captain Garnet of the Thaddeus Stevens School. This will be followed by a pledge of allegiance led by Danville's current postmaster, Lindy Toronto. Immediately following by a invocation sent by Reverend Robert Sargent, who is a pastor of the North Danville Baptist Church. So I'm asking you to please rise and remain standing throughout the
States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Most gracious and living Creator, we thank you for your servant, the remarkable, radical Thaddeus Stevens. Born in Vermont, raised in poverty with a physical disability, abandoned by his father, his strength of character and powerful voice of reason helped to bring human rights to all people in the forming of this country. As we dedicate a post office to his memory, we remember his words, "Build not your monuments of brass or marble, but make them of ever-living mind." As one of the most influential representatives ever to serve in Congress, he fought tirelessly for the abolition of slavery and for universal education, abhorring the words compromise when applied to human rights. On this anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, abolishing slavery, may we be reminded of the courage of Thaddeus Stevens every time we passed our post office. He was indeed your servant, called radical in believing that all people were indeed created equal, regardless of race or gender, even as your only son was radical in his time. We do indeed thank you for your servant, the man of faith, of whom it was written shortly before his death, "If to die crowned with noble laurels and secure the respect of the world is an end worthy the ambition of a well-spent life, then the veteran, radical, may lie down with the noblest of the fathers to a well-contested sleep. And finally, most living God, may our dedication of our post office in honor of Thaddeus Stevens remind us every day of what we owe to those who have gone before us. And may he, his own words as his epitaph, keep his memory alive. I will, he said, be satisfied if my epitaph shall be written thus. Here lies one who never rose to any eminence, and who only counted the low ambition to have it said that he had striven to ameliorate the condition of the poor, the lonely, the downtrodden of every race and language and color. We do indeed thank you for your servant, and we pray in the name of another remarkable radical. Amen.
Please be seated. We're gathered here today to learn about Thaddeus Stevens, an abolitionist, former lawyer, member of Congress. And as you know, it requires an act of Congress to rename the Postal facility. To help introduce you to the sponsor of legislation that makes this renaming possible, allow me to introduce my boss, the District Manager of Postal Service for Northern Community.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. As the district manager for the Northern New England District, I am proud to lead a team of dedicated postal employees who provide mail service to over 1.8 million homes, businesses, and post office boxes in Northern New England. Bordering New York to the west, the Atlantic Ocean and Canada to the east, Massachusetts to the south, and Canada to the north. Vermont is an essential part of that assignment. Around the nation, only a select number of post office buildings are dedicated to honor great Americans. Here in Vermont, there are only 2 other postal buildings with such designation. The Fairhaven Post Office was dedicated in 2006 to the name of the Revolutionary hero, Matthew Lyon. He would go on to serve in the Vermont House of Representatives and in the U.S. Congress. Also, the Rutland Post Office building was rededicated to honor Robert T. Stafford, the former governor, who also served as a member of both the House and the Congress. Today, we welcome one more post office to that elite list. The Danville Post Office will now be housed in the Thaddeus Stevens Post Office building, following passage of a 2014 bill proposed by U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders, who joins us today. Born in Brooklyn, Senator Sanders put in a change of address and moved to Vermont after graduating college. He has served as mayor of Burlington, as a member of Congress in the House of Representatives, and now in his second term in the U.S. Senate. Senator Sanders was tapped by Senate leadership to be the ranking member of the Senate Budget Committee. He remains on the Veterans Committee and also serves on committees for Environment and Public Works and for Energy and Natural Resources. Please welcome Senator Sanders.
Catherine, wonderful job. Thank you very much. And Lindy and Reverend Margaret Sargent and Brandon Michelle. Also, I want to thank Paul Bernard from the Danville Historical Society, who's worked on this for so many years, and Ross Pitcher, a friend from Pennsylvania, from Gettysburg, with Thaddeus Stevens. They are moved, and thank you very much, Congressman Peter Welch. He would not have been able to do this without Peter's effort in the House, and some of the fact that he was behind us all quite the way. I think one of the things that we don't do so well as Americans is remember where we came, what came before us, and how we became what we are. And this small town, in a very disability, which in all likelihood gave him a sense of compassion, to know what it's like, in struggle. Maybe have people who put you down, which are quite like some people. And he is a man, was a man, who, if you look at those pictures of this guy's a tough guy. He is a austere man. He was a man who believed very strongly in human equality. And when he went and was leader of the House Ways and Means Committee, he led the effort to literally make slavery illegal in the United States of America. One thing to talk about an Emancipation Proclamation which freed the slaves of occupied areas. It's another thing to say it is the policy of the United States that in every state in this country, slavery is going to be illegal. And that was pretty radical. And he had to organize the Congress to do that. He had to pay attention to what we as a society don't pay attention to. He was a politician. The word politician, of bringing people together to pass things, should not be seen as a bad word. It is a good word in a democratic society. But his strength was that he went beyond that. What he also said is not just that we should abolish the abomination of slavery, we should be talking about equal rights. We should be talking about African Americans as an integral part of our society with voting rights, with full rights as a citizen. That took him beyond emancipation. And that was a pretty radical act. That was a pretty radical act at that time. Some of us can remember, it wasn't 50, 60 years ago in the United States of America, African Americans couldn't go to white high schools. People couldn't use water fountains. 50 or 60 years ago, and in his time, back in the 1860s, he said that is not what America should be. We should break down these color barriers. A man way, way, way ahead of his time. And while he's perhaps best known in the struggle for civil rights and equality, that was not his only achievement. He fought for the idea of public education. Again, an idea that we take for granted today. But it wasn't always the case that working class kids had the opportunity to go to school way back then. These were the kids who were working in the mills. They were working on the farms. And his idea was to say that education should be available to all of the children, regardless of the income of their parents. A pretty radical idea. So we are here today to honor a man who played an enormously important role in American history. We are here to honor a man who was strong throughout the Civil War, a war in which this state played an extraordinary role. I don't know how many of you, when you drive around the state, stop in the town greens and take a look at the monuments. Have any of you done that? And you see the names of people who served and died in the Civil War. It's extraordinary. Small towns. So many young people died in that war because this state was in a leadership position, not only on the battlefield, but politically, to say that we are going to abolish slavery. And Thaddeus Stevens, who then moved to Pennsylvania, was a leader of that. So in the program that we have today, there's a quote which I think is very apt. It summarizes Thaddeus Stevens' life. And this is what he says, quote, "It is easy to protect the interests of the rich and powerful, but it is a great labor to protect the interests of the poor and the downtrodden." End of quote. That's Thaddeus Stevens in 1866. It was true then. It is true now. I want to thank everybody for coming out, for taking pride in acknowledging a man from this town who played such an extraordinarily important role in American history. Thank you all very much for being here.
Joining the effort in the United States Senate to rededicate the building was your colleague and our Senator, Honorable Patrick Leahy. Although Senator is unable to join us today, he asked to share some remarks on his presentation. To read those kind words, allow me to introduce and welcome John Tracy, State Director for the Office of Senator Leahy.
It's an honor to be here. The trouble with following verses is that it covers everything, so I've got about a paragraph left. And Reverend Sergeant as well. But the bottom line is, we're here today to celebrate what Thaddeus Stevens did. And you don't need to look any further than our Congressional delegation, our states and local leaders, and the citizens in Vermont to show that we've always been a better job and have never been afraid to speak up and say what's right. And Thaddeus Stevens' legacy even lives on today, as we felt the board discussed. Two quotes I'd like to read. There's been a reference to how hard he worked to make sure that we had advances in civil rights, social justice, the end of slavery, public education, which was something he worked very hard to achieve, and financial reform. Some of the issues we're still dealing with today. So when the legislators from Virginia, Kentucky, and Mississippi insisted that other states not criticize the practice that they have of slavery, he said, every citizen of the non-slaveholding states has a right freely to think and publish his thoughts on any subject of national or state policy. Nor can he be compelled to confine his remarks to such subjects that affect only the state in which he resides. He was not going to have his voice muzzled because of what other states practice around slavery. About public education. The blessing of education shall be carried home to the poorest child, of the poorest inhabitant, of the meanest hut, to your mountains, so that everyone, even he, may be prepared to act well his part in this land of free men. Now, even though he had a club foot, he had a sharp tongue, and he was quick on his feet. And I hope this is historically accurate.
I'll tell you.
I knew you would. Just don't create it. There's a story where he was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and one of his enemies, and he acquired a few over time, was coming the other way down an alley. And the guy said, the man shouted at Thaddeus, I never get out of the way of a skunk. Stephen stood aside and replied, I always do. Bottom line is, we're here today because of the work and the legacy that Thaddeus left us. We as Vermonters represent our delegations, our state and local leaders, and our citizens still do that today. I was going to quote, is that the path? You took that? But the bottom line is how he should be remembered, that he's for the poor, the downtrodden, of any race, of any gender. I think he has every right to be satisfied, to be proud of his legacy. And on behalf of Senator Leahy, it's an honor to be here to celebrate this day. Thanks.
Thank you. For a bill to become law, it takes a champion in the Senate and the House of Representatives. Our own Representative Peter Welch steered legislation through the House that was necessary to make the renaming possible. Peter Welch has served Vermont in a career as a state legislator and since 2006 a member of Congress. In 2011, Congressman Welch was appointed to serve Chief Deputy Whip of the House Democratic Caucus. He serves on the Committee on Energy and Commerce Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. On behalf of zip code 05828, I am proud to introduce Honorable Peter Welch.
What a pleasure to be here today with you, our folks from the Postal Service, with one of the best legislative leaders in all of Vermont, our own Jane Official, and to be here just to celebrate this extraordinary individual. And Bernie, it was a great job you did in the Senate working with Patrick to get this passed. But I just want to say, that quote you mentioned about Thaddeus Stevens that we're all proud of. It's easy to protect the interest of the rich and powerful, but it's a great labor to protect the interest of the poor and the downtrodden. Bernie Sanders, thank you for carrying on and continuing Thaddeus Stevens' tradition. We've heard from our previous speakers about just the incredible commitment that Thaddeus Stevens had to equal justice, human rights for all people, and that he even had a sense of humor. What I want to talk a little bit about is Vermonters. He was a Vermonter. And keep in mind that it is true that the Historical Society does to help us remember where we came from so that we can be aware that we're part of a tradition. The Vermont Constitution was the first constitution in our entire United States that banned slavery. It was our Constitution that said there shall be no slavery in Vermont, even as the United States Constitution was allowing it to happen. And Thaddeus Stevens was affected by that, as all Vermonters were. That's the tradition that we've had. And fast forward, our state became the first state where women got the right to vote. Our state took on another contentious issue recently about marriage. And you know, every time we face tough choices, Vermonters have decided on behalf of embracing the whole human condition and saying every single one of us has the right to do the best we can to achieve the opportunities that are out there. You know, this is the other thing, is Thaddeus Stevens went to Pennsylvania, but he came from Vermont. And you know, it's a testament to the wisdom of everyday people who grow up in tough circumstances, and if they're going to survive, have to have their wits about them, but they also have to find ways to take and help other people in their community. And you know, we see that here in Caledonia County, with neighbors helping neighbors, with people being incredibly self-reliant, but even in that enormous sense of self and that enormous confidence one has to have to make it on their own. They know that it's only by doing things together that we're ultimately all going to be successful. And that commitment to human rights for Thaddeus Stevens at a time when African Americans in this society were not only despised, but they were property, where the United States Supreme Court, when it was faced with the question of whether a white person and an African American person were both people, our United States Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision, the highest law of the land, said an African American was not a person. In that time, Thaddeus Stevens would have none of it. And I have to believe that his ability to carry on in the face of enormous conflict and rejection had so much to do with being born right here in Danville, Vermont, and going to school in Peacham. And every one of us as Vermonters can take pride, but if we take some pride in that extraordinary person, let's learn the lesson of his commitment to human rights for all of us and do whatever it is we can to carry on the tradition of Thaddeus Stevens. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. Speaking to our fellow Vermonters on this occasion, allow me to introduce State Senator Jane Gifford.
Welcome, everyone. I am one of Danville's daughters, and there are others in my family, of which we have many, who grew up in Danville. And I have to say, as a child, I spent a lot of time on Danville Bridge. Helen McDonald lived in the White House, or after she moved from the farm to the green. And so we spent a lot of time, on our knees more than once or twice, riding our bikes around. But we knew who Thaddeus Stevens was from the time we could read because of the marker on Danville Green. And in many ways, we were proud, and yet we knew that he probably didn't have the stature or the fame that he really deserved for the role that he played. And it's interesting that a movie, in fact, brought Thaddeus Stevens to the forefront for many, many Americans. Certainly, I knew of Thaddeus Stevens and his role from growing up in Danville, his place of birth. But also, I went to school in Pennsylvania, and interestingly enough, there's Caledonia State Park. And that was named by Thaddeus Stevens. He had the Caledonia furnace, or the forge that was there, and the program or the description of Thaddeus Stevens talks about that it was burned by Jubal Early in the war. Sometimes it was attributed because of his view on opposition to slavery. For those of us who serve in the State House, I think we are reminded daily of the role that Vermont played in the Civil War, because our State House has been described as really a Civil War museum. And the Historical Society and the Danville Chamber of Commerce put together funding so that, in fact, we have a portrait of Thaddeus Stevens in the State House to recognize his role as a Vermonter, and who really, when you think about it, took all the values that we have in our Vermont tradition, whether it was because of our Constitution or just because of the values that we have as a culture. When you think about it, social justice, a Constitution that outlawed slavery, a Constitution that really provided for public education from the very beginning of the state, a sense of overcoming adversity, whether it was poverty or disability, or having only a single mother, who I would believe embodies that whole strong and spirited women of the Northeast Kingdom, and hard work, and the personal courage to stand up for what is right. And you think about Vermonters who have come after Thaddeus Stevens, whether it was Ralph Flanders, who was in the U.S. Senate, with McCarthyism at its height, calling for censure of Senator McCarthy, which was a very courageous thing to do. Or think about George Aiken with the Vietnam War, who was very much in the Vermont common sense, just declaring victory and home. So I think for those of us who grew up in Danville, my family is from Danville, it's wonderful to have some recognition for someone who really is played such an important role in the Civil War, and really as you look back at the history of this country. So on behalf of the locals, which I'm one, my grandmother, McDonald, someone talked about someone being a local, and she said, he's not a local, he's from Barton. I've moved on a little from that, and we welcome all the people who made today's dedication possible. Thank you very much.
Preserving the historic riches of small communities such as Danville is daunting work. There are documents, records, artifacts, and oral stories that need tending and care. We are in good hands in Danville. Today to speak on behalf of the Danville Historical Society, President Patty Bowden-Conley.
Welcome everyone to our beautiful village in the hills. I'm somewhat biased because I too grew up in Danville, and I do have to say that it is one of the most picturesque towns in all of Vermont. One of the most picturesque towns. The Danville Historical Society and the entire Danville community are very pleased and excited to have our post office renamed to prominently and permanently recognize such an important and influential individual who was born right here in our town. I personally am proud to call my hometown the birthplace of such an instrumental figure in the evolution of human and civil rights. It is truly amazing testimony for all that even those born, raised, and educated under adverse conditions in little towns like Danville and Peacham can be inspired to go on to do great things. Thaddeus Stevens' physical location and the events of the day influenced his future political career as well. Danville was a political hotbed of activity during that period of time when Thaddeus was in his impressionable years and was home to no fewer than 6 prominent lawyers and a judge, all of whom had offices right here on the green. Danville had been designated the shire town and the home of the county seat, prompting the construction of a courthouse, an elegant 2-story wooden structure which was completed in 1801, very close to the site where we're gathered here today. Better roads were constructed which radiated in every direction of the green leading to the courthouse, and enhanced mail delivery led to the establishment of our first post office. Danville had been selected to host the 1805 legislative session, for which about 200 legislators were expected to descend on the town, mostly on horseback, and many boarded with area families. The legislature would meet at the new courthouse, while the governor and his council would meet at the tavern owned by Thaddeus Stevens' great-uncle, Morrow. These factors likely exposed this bright, impressionable young man who would now become a student at the Caledonia County Grammar School and teach him to the legislative process at a very early age. It was at this session of the legislature that the state endorsed the proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution to end the slave trade. The endorsement stated that universal freedom is one of those fundamental principles of our political institution which are engraved on the mind and live in the affection of every true American. These words, formulated and discussed right here in this approximate location, became the very words that would exemplify and guide Thaddeus Stevens in his future endeavors and influence him in developing the values and the principles he exercised in both his law practice and his political affiliation. It is most appropriate that we gather here today to honor our distinguished native son in one of our town's most beautiful and historic buildings, both in the month of his birth and at the culmination of the sesquicentennial celebration of the end of the Civil War. Until recent years, there has been very little public recognition or commemoration, especially in the state of Vermont, recognizing the enormous contribution that Thaddeus Stevens made to effect the emancipation of the slaves and grant them civil rights. In 2010, the Danville Historical Society commissioned an etched portrait of Thaddeus Stevens to be presented to the Vermont State House to hang in the gallery alongside other prominent Vermonters. An identical portrait, the one you saw as you entered the hall here today, also graces the halls, proudly graces the halls, or the wall at the Danville Historical Society. It is therefore very fitting that we will now be able to enjoy the opportunity to see and remember the name Thaddeus Stevens each time we enter the building that is a focal point and the center of daily life for this community and the surrounding area. We thank you, Senator Sanders, and all those who were instrumental in gaining congressional approval to secure the renaming of the Danville Post Office in honor of Thaddeus Stevens. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. While we're fortunate to have the Danville Historical Society to guide us for preserving our past, we look to our future generation to continue our story. Maybe they'll speak about the gathering as a historic event for our community. Again, I think we're going to be in good hands based on our next speaker. Providing us with reading, representing the Thaddeus Stevens School, let me recognize and welcome Duncan Delivio. Duncan, please.
I'd like to thank you for including us in this area. I'd like to tell you how our school honors Thaddeus Stevens' legacy every day. Our school honors Thaddeus Stevens by remembering that he stood for the law and for inclusion. All students in the 7th and 8th grade are supplied with pocket constitutions and we often refer to them during our discussions about controversial issues facing America today. Each April, we, the students, conduct a mock trial at the Calhoun Courthouse, which is the culmination of 3 weeks of intense discussion about equal protection of the law. This year, our case dealt with the issues of hate crimes, the First Amendment, and racial profiling. I was an attorney for the prosecution against hate crimes and racial profiling, my side line. Thaddeus Stevens School students learned to question stereotypes. We discussed the damage they can cause. We talked about ways to remove prejudice from our perspectives. Each year, we participate in the National African American Reading Day. Students read excerpts by African American authors throughout the day and evening. We host an annual Martin Luther King candlelight vigil that is open to the public in order to celebrate the work of Dr. King. All of this is to remind us that African Americans have participated in American culture since our country's earliest years. Our school is a member of the National First Amendment School Network. These schools are, quote, designed to transform how schools teach and practice the rights and responsibilities of citizenship that frame civic life in our democracy, end quote. As students, we are constantly reminded that our economic status cannot dictate our futures. Thaddeus Stevens overcame more obstacles than most of us will face in a lifetime. His path led him to become the author of the 2 most important civil rights laws ever written, the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery in this country, and the 14th Amendment that guaranteed equal protection of the law. Most kids never have any idea who their school is actually named after. At Thaddeus Stevens School, we know who our school is named after, and we honor his legacy every day. Thank you.
We have a musical guest with us today. It's a pleasure to introduce Paul Christopher Mouchetti.
Thank you so much. I'm originally from Long Island, New York. I live now in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This is the Ballad of Thaddeus Stevens. Men of iron, men of steel, helped to turn the wheel at the ironworks that he owned just west of town. It helped the times and eased the fears of all the mothers who had tears by bringing heat to every schoolroom then around. He'd been in Gettysburg for years, speaking wisdom and easing fears, doing good things for many people in the town. Just a common man, they say, and he proved it every day, leaving a legacy in the future men would say. They say Thaddeus believed in learning as the answer to people's troubles, and he knew if you could educate and solve folks' needs for learning, it would help fulfill their dreams and their yearnings. Clubfoot and hope and a staggering life of work gave Thaddeus his ability to propel. And as he began to gain through a lifetime of pain, being called the devil's child, misunderstood. But to see he really knew his part by following his heart in that capital city we call Washington. He helped pass laws that set men free, but did anyone ever see it was Thaddeus who would illuminate our mind? Now when I look around today, I understand why people say it was Stevens who would help the common man. I see a classroom or a school, they further mankind evermore. I see Thaddeus Stevens smiling at the door. You see the Thaddeus believed that learning was the answer to people's troubles, and he knew if you could educate and solve folks' need for learning, it would help fulfill their dreams and their yearnings. Men of iron, men of steel, helped to turn the wheel, and the ironworks that he owned just went him down.
Thank you, Paul, so much for that piece. It's been 150 years since the end of the Civil War, a time that washed our young nation in the bloodshed of others. During the height of the war, in the halls of Congress, Thaddeus Stevens remained an unshaken voice for justice, due process, law, and equality. Despite his failing health, he would also put his stamp on the Reconstruction movement as our nation took its first step towards recovery after those dark days. As they make a short walk, I would like to extend our sincere appreciation to the Thaddeus Stevens School. You have shared your talents with us today, Catherine and Duncan, and we thank you very much for that. We've also extended a very sincere thanks to Mr. Ken Lindsley from Danville Select Board for the many courtesies extended to us preparing today's program. Thank you. It's a pleasure to introduce Ross Hetrick as well.
Hello, everybody. I'm Ross Hetrick. I'm president of the Thaddeus Stevens Society. And today's event is a great treat for me. I mean, it's just sort of like soaking in a warm bath for hours and hours, hearing all this praise for Thaddeus Stevens. In fact, I'm having a video made of this, and I may just put it on a continuous loop in my apartment. I'll show you all the time. We came up from Gettysburg, which is a 12-hour drive, and I think that we're the people who've come the furthest. Is anybody who's come further than Gettysburg here? Okay, well, people from the Gettysburg area raised their hands. I brought along a little bit of the audience with me. One thing I wanted to point out that's kind of interesting is that this is actually not the first post office that will bear Thaddeus Stevens' name. There is a small town just north of Lancaster called Stevens, named after Thaddeus Stevens. Hence, there is a Stevens Post Office in Stevens, PA. Now, it's interesting that they named it after Thaddeus Stevens, but they didn't name it because he was father of the 14th Amendment, or that he pushed through the 13th Amendment, or that he was the architect of Reconstruction, or any of those great things. The reason they named their town after Thaddeus Stevens was because he got them a post office. So he was in constituent service. So there has been great things happening with Thaddeus Stevens recently, like the movie, which has just been wonderful for us. And there's also now a statue in Lancaster, the first statue of Thaddeus Stevens ever put up in 2008. A new biography is going to be coming out about Thaddeus Stevens by Bruce Levin, a well-known historian. And so there's lots of things happening with Thaddeus Stevens. However, what we really, really, really need is a museum about Thaddeus Stevens. And so I was pressing to see that there is a museum either in Gettysburg, or Lancaster, or maybe even up here. So maybe there could be like a little contest to see who gets the first Thaddeus Stevens up and running. And one of the things that was pointed out was Thaddeus Stevens was a great wit. In fact, I would call him the funniest congressman in history. Though, no offense, I don't think that would be too much competition. But anyway, he was a very funny congressman. And I came across a particular story that concerned Vermont. And this is from Harper's Weekly. And it said, one winter, when Thaddeus Stevens had come back to Vermont home, he was the victim of a severe cold and could not leave the house for many weeks. One of his scholars was the late Lewis Clark, a man of short stature, who in earlier days had been a playmate of the old common. and was a near neighbor of the Stevens family in their Peacham home. Vermonters had just begun to wear buffalo coats, and Mr. Clark arrived in the Stevens home almost lost in a coat which reached to the ground. His upturned collar completely covered his ears and face, while a fur cap completed the disguise. "Is that you, Lewis?" asked Mr. Stevens in an incredulous tone. "Yes, Dad," he replied. "Well, skin yourself and sit down." While the interesting conversation was followed, Mr. Clark asked Stevens if he wouldn't come back to his Vermont home where he had lived, or where he would have lived. "No," replied Stevens, "you have but 2 seasons here, winter and late in the fall." And I can attest to that since we are in springtime down in Pennsylvania right now, and you still have snow on the ground. So the last thing I would like to leave you with is his actual epitaph. The epitaph that was read earlier was an epitaph that he displayed during the debate about the 13th Amendment. Now, I don't want to steal your thunder. Were you going to use that epitaph? Okay. His actual epitaph, which is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in the Shriner Concord Cemetery. He refused to be buried in any segregated cemetery. And this was the only integrated cemetery in town. And the epitaph goes, "I repose in this quiet and secluded spot, not from any natural preference for solitude, but finding other cemeteries limited as to race by charter rules. I have chosen this, that I might